launch of the Bohemian Love Diaries before I take off on my tour. You know, part of my mission is helping others kind of step out of their comfort zone to take a chance to become a better person. And when part of the theme of the Bohemian Love Diaries is the child-parent relationship in terms of artists. You know, I grew up with 8 artists in my family, very creative environment. And so that's why I invited some kids up here tonight. Henry's book, which is called The BSA Lightning, I commissioned him to write a book about the motorcycle that my dad drove during the whole first chapter of the book and for a couple chapters. And so that's why he came to read. And then Owen I met, he did the voiceover work on my book trailer. And if you haven't seen it, it's a really cool book trailer. It's like a cartoon with his voice. He plays like the 9-year-old version of me. So another round of applause for all 3 guys that opened up for me tonight. So I guess you're here to hear me do something out of this, right? Yeah. The Bohemian Love Diaries? Yeah, so a piece I'm going to read tonight is, it's interesting because I'm used to performing. This is brand new that I have to read. But what I'm going to do is actually perform a piece from Chapter 2, Major League Pop Fly. And it's interesting because the book is broken up into 3 parts. And in the first part, it's all my childhood. And these are stories I've been making my living with for the last 3 years on the National Storytelling Festival circuit. And when my agent asked me, you know what, I want like those stories in the book, I took those stories that I had created through the oral tradition. None of them had been written, and I had to write them down to put them in the first part of the book. And it was very different to go through this process of like taking something that had been created orally and write it down. And when I wrote all those stories down, because the second half of the book was all stuff that I created when I was adult. I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. And so when we gave it to my publisher was like, what is this? I was like, those are the stories people think they're funny. I perform them all the time. He's like, it's very different stuff. You're going to have to go back and rewrite these stories that were never written to begin with to make them sound like they were written. And so we went through and we swept through the whole book to give them that common voice. And so this is from Chapter 2. It's called Major League Pop Fly. So during this time of year when it gets kind of warm out like this, towards the end of July, when it's almost to August, I begin to think about 2 things. One is baseball, Little League baseball, and 2 is my first crush, because it happened during this time of year. And now, it's the same back then as it is now when I had a crush. When I had a crush when I was a kid, it was a lot like being an English major, because when I had a crush and I was around that person, just like when you tell someone you're an English major, the other person tends to get uncomfortably quiet. And if you wait for the silence, you can hear some laughter coming from somewhere. It could be from the girl, it could be from you inside, or it could be from the English store, which is where all the English majors work, from a land far away. And so at a young age, I developed a very sophisticated plan to deal with my crushes. And that was what I learned in fire safety class, stop, drop, and roll. And so, for instance, being a romantic, I might develop at least 14 crushes from the time I eat breakfast in the morning until the time lunchtime exists. And so my very first crush was with a girl when I was 8 years old. She was like me, no taller than a lampshade. And I was in like with her for 3 specific reasons. One, she had so many freckles on her face. And I used to climb up on my bunk bed at night and imagine those freckles like little golden squares of Captain Crunch spread out across the nighttime sky. And I used to think about her there, staring out the window on the top bunk of my bunk bed, late July. And 2, her name was Johnny Elizabeth Ford, 7 syllables. We had just learned about syllables in Mrs. Albright's class, and I figured the more syllables, the better. Her name had 7 syllables. It was crush-worthy. And 3, she was the only girl allowed to play on the all-boys Little League baseball team. Coming from a family of artists, I knew I had to take matters into my own hand because my parents weren't into sports. In fact, they forbid me to play sports for many years. Whenever I brought it up with my mom, she always said the same thing, which she repeated in the classic Yiddish, French, kind of southern accent that her mom repeated to her own brothers when they wanted to play sports. If you play sports, you will get paralyzed. Spots. She called them spots, as if you would break out in spots. And so for the longest time, I thought these spots were like a plague from the Old Testament. And she couldn't even say the word paralyzed right, pair of lies. And for the longest time, I thought this pair of pants would descend from the sky like a plague from the Old Testament and squeeze me like a boa constrictor if I stepped onto a baseball diamond until I couldn't breathe and I'd just fall over. And whenever I brought up sports to my father, he always said the same thing. Now, he was a Sicilian raised in a little chicken shack in West Virginia with a dirt floor. He would look at me and say, you can't hunt it, you can't build it, you can't fish it, it ain't worth doing. And that was that. And so just to give you an idea of the conversation that took place in the visual, my dad had what was known as a white man perm at the time. And a white man perm always made a man look like he had a big gluten-free bowl of macaroni salad sitting on his head. Like a huge bowl, the kind you take to a 4th of July picnic in one of those green Tupperware containers that serve like 75 people. He had a thick black beard. And during this time in his artistic career, he was making sculptures out of roadkill and attempting to support our family. And so he'd come home on his motorcycle with Tasmanian devils, werewolves, and otters slung across the motorcycle. He'd take them down into the basement, which is where the studio was, off from the kitchen where his art studio was. And he was taking taxidermy classes at the time, too. And he'd reconfigure these animals into very specific sculptures. He had big bread baking ovens in his studio as well. And so a typical sculpture might have the head of the turtle, the legs of a lizard, and the body of pumpernickel. And so when we had enough of these sculptures, he and I would take the van and drive them up to the Wyman Gallery in Chicago. And whatever didn't sell would come back home, and they would find a place in our backyard. And so our backyard sort of always looked like a combination between a Wonder Bread thrift store graveyard and a Joseph Mengele petting zoo. And now, my mom loved my dad's hairdo so much that she went out and got a white man perm herself. She's about a 4-foot, 90-pound version of me. And now, but that's where their differences end, because they couldn't be more different than one another. My dad is Catholic, my mom is Jewish, which makes me a cashew, right? And so I knew that if I was going to take my relationship with Johnny Elizabeth Ford to the next level, having two parents that didn't want me involved in sports, I was going to have to do that on my own. And so I went down to my father's art studio one day, and I found a leather baseball mitt in the leather pile where he kept the remnants of his roadkill scraps. And I walked the 2 blocks to Bellwood Elementary School on my own to try out for the baseball team to take my relationship with Johnny Elizabeth Ford to the next level. I waited on home plate with 9 other boys and 1 girl. The smell of Hubba Bubba bubblegum, watermelon flavored, wafted in the air, mixed with the freshly oiled gloves and the fresh stained denim and the spring air. And then our coach walked up, and he dropped the ball bag right on home plate, and then his smell mixed with our own. He was a man who wore Brut by Fabergé. You know, I mean, they still sell this at Walgreens, right? It was the cologne made popular by Muhammad Ali, Wilt Chamberlain, and James Bond. And if ever there was a smell that said, go where no man has gone before, it was this smell. And so I knew that this was the man that would help me take my relationship with this girl to the next level. We looked up to Coach Walt. He was nearly 12 feet tall, although over 6 feet. 6 of those feet was due to his own white man perm. And he looked down at us and he lectured us on the merits of catching the Major League pop fly. We didn't know what he was talking about. Gentlemen, he said, and I like that he called us gentlemen, even though we were all little kids that still slept in our underoos. Gentlemen, in just a few minutes I'm going to have you take the field, and you are going to catch the hardest, highest hit balls imaginable. Balls that might rise so high and disintegrate by the time they enter the Earth's atmosphere and fall into your glove. And gentlemen, it is not your job to catch the Major League pop fly. No, sir. It's your job to look inviting. The invited ball will find its way into your mitt just as sure as hot tea from a tea kettle finds its way to a teacup sitting in a tea sauce, sir. And everything else during this day, gentlemen, will be easy if I start you out catching Major League pop flies. Yes, sir. Everything else will be easy. Relativity speaking. I knew Coach Walt was a very smart man after I heard that. Now, we didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, and we were confused for one reason. We understood the Major League pop flies, but we didn't understand the description of this hot tea. We were all Southern boys, raised on sweet tea, and it was only created in one way. You created sweet tea by taking a huge clear glass, filling it up with one huge bag of sugar until it spilled over, bag of white sugar. Then you put a tiny ice cube on the top. Let that ice cube melt just a little bit. You put a Lipton tea bag between your teeth, and then you swish the whole thing down. And so this hot tea from a tea kettle poured into a teacup on a tea saucer just didn't compute. And so we walked out into the field when he said, "Now, gentlemen, hit the field." And we were kind of confused. And so the thing about a man who has a white man perm is that always a man had usually developed what was called a rock star tick, or what I call the macaroni shake, from that gluten-free macaroni salad bowl sitting on his head. Now, it had been made famous by the famous musician Peter Frampton, called the rock star tick. And so when a man had hair like this, if it moved in front of his eyes, instead of moving it out with his fingers, he would simply flick his head like this to move the hair out of his eyes. And this made a man appear to be saying no when he wasn't saying no, and it made it hard to know when he was saying no. And so as we walked into the outfield to see if we had gone in back there far enough, occasionally one of us boys would look behind to see if we had walked far enough, and there would be Coach Walt flicking his head no. And see, we walked right out of the outfield, through the teacher's parking lot, down to the school, and we would have walked through the school. I know because one of the kids that had his mitt on his head checked the door, but the door was locked. And so we just spread out there by the bushes of Bellwood Elementary School in a little kid puddle and just waited. And then one of the tallest boys, he separated himself from us, and he said, "My mama's a Yankee. She drinks hot tea out of a tea kettle." And then he put his ungloved hand on his hip. And it looked just like the handle on a tea kettle. And then he put his gloved hand out like it was the spout on a tea kettle. And I have to say, he looked quite inviting. And so all 9 of us boys and 1 girl spread ourselves out there near the bushes of Bellwood Elementary School like 9 inviting tea kettles. And we waited for the balls to arrive. Now, these Major League pop flies must have been hard to hit because Coach Walt looked like a tiny little man about 3 miles away, and the bat he was holding looked like a toothpick, and the ball he kept throwing up and missing looked like a dot that had been erased, and a bunch of us boys started to get distracted. And so one of the kids, the kid with the glove on his head, he sat down in a patch of 4-leaf clovers and started looking for a lucky 4-leaf clover. And then the tallest boy, he started making squishing sounds with his mouth. And I started looking at the sun. And I noticed when I looked at the sun and looked away, a bright kaleidoscope of lights would dance in front of my eyes. Look away, kaleidoscope. Look away, kaleidoscope. And it reminded me of my Bee Gees album at home, Saturday Night Fever, starring the disco king John Travolta. The movie had come out the year before, but I wasn't allowed to see it. But my father bought me the double album featuring the Bee Gees songs that featured all the dances that John Travolta did during the movie. And on each page, which was an 80-page booklet inside that double album, there were red footprints for the men and yellow footprints for the women. And if you followed the footprints and listened to the song, you could dance along. And so as my distraction became deeper, I would look away, kaleidoscope, dance. Look away, kaleidoscope, dance. Look away, kaleidoscope, dance. And that Bee Gees song started playing in my head. Look away, you can tell by the way I use my walk. Come on, look away, kaleidoscope, dance. Use my head, I'm a winning man. No time. Look away. I never even noticed that the balls started to arrive. The first 3 landed on top of the school. The 4th and 5th one hit the side of the school so hard it chipped away a huge part of the brick. One of the boys started yelling incoming, and another guy said if we didn't run away and Coach Walt ran out of balls, we'd surely be killed. Look away, kaleidoscope. I was the first one to go down. I got hit right between the eyes and face planted right into the grass. And shortly after that, the kid with the hit on his mitt, the kid with the mitt on his head, he got hit in the shoulder, and he wobbled over and fell in the bushes. I vaguely remember being pulled around to the side of the school. And when I woke up, I was in Miss Ottenbright's class. It was one of those days when we got to eat our lunch in the classroom and watch a film strip. It was a film strip about something archaeology. And I remember watching the film strip and reaching into my bag of Cheetos, which was on the desk between mine and someone else's, and I was surprised to find that my hand touched someone else's inside that bag of Cheetos. And I froze. A jolt of electricity ran through my body. My hand was touching Johnny Elizabeth Ford's hand. And she looked right at me. I looked at her. And she sang, I lie, 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 I really like you. I didn't know what to say. And so I looked at her. And I said, you like me? And she said, I really, 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 really like you. You like me? I really la 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 like you. And then I woke up in Coach Walt's arms, which is a great way to end a love story about baseball, right? And so Coach Walt walked me the 2 blocks to my parents' house, and all the baseball team walked behind us like they were seagulls following a shrimp trawler into the docks. And when we got to my parents' house, Coach Walt knocked on the screen door, and my mom appeared. And she reacted the same way that she would react every time a coach delivered me to the door during my long and risky sports career. During 6th grade at Salem Elementary School, I would fling myself off the high bar during gymnastics practice and knock myself out on one of those halogen gym ceiling lamps. Poor Mr. Prestovic, he was only 4 feet tall. He had to put me on one of those blue gymnastics mats, like a little open-faced burrito, a tostado really, and he had to drag me to the car and deliver me to my mom. And Mr. Kopp, poor Mr. Kopp, when I hit 12th grade, I was the only person in my high school history to lose every varsity wrestling match for 2 years straight within the first 3 seconds. Take a deep breath in. I just lost a match. Take another deep breath in. I just lost another match. I calculated it out. By the time my junior and senior years were over, I lost the equivalent of 33 in-and-out breaths. And so when Coach Kopp delivered me to the door, because I had been knocked out of my tights during my escape from the last match of my senior year, trying to escape from what was called a seatbelt single, which Coach Kopp called an anatomical enigma, getting knocked out of my tights, but I still don't know what that means. My mom looked at those coaches the same way that she did Coach Walt, and she said, oh, what is this? And she took me from Coach Walt. And just before she turned to go into the house, Johnny Elizabeth Ford kissed her hand and pushed it on my cheek. And I knew in that moment I had taken my relationship with her to the next level. Now, the next day, my dad went to go give Coach Walt a piece of his mind, and he came back with 2 things. One, he came back and he had decided that he was going to be Coach Walt's assistant coach, and he would remain in that position until I went off to college. And 2, I don't know what they did, but they got re-permed. He came back with the super white man perm. And let me tell you, the next week my mom went and got a super white man perm herself, and they would keep those hairdos long after they had been banned from fashion. Thanks.